The chandeliers were dimmed just enough to smooth every line and soften every flaw. Crystal clinked like ice on a winter lake. At the main table, my mother wore silver, and certainty, one hand resting lightly on a place card, as if even the seating bowed to her will. I stood in emerald green at the edge of the glow, a single breath away from speaking. I had rehearsed the words, practiced the smile, even the tilt of my chin. I tapped my glass once. The room quieted. And when I finished a careful, respectful toast to the woman who taught me excellence, she looked at me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said almost playfully, "A 6-month trip to take pictures. A paid vacation. Catherine, you're not getting a cent. You've always been—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. If you've ever felt the ground shift under your feet while people pretended not to notice, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever been treated like you didn't matter, tap that like button and share this with someone who'll understand. Make sure you're subscribed so you won't miss what comes next. But to understand how a birthday toast turned into a breaking point, you need to know what came before it, how quiet can be learned the way posture is through years of correction. I grew up in a house that always smelled like lemon polish and restraint. Our dining room had an oak table that could seat 12 and still feel formal. The chairs never once scraped the floor because we were taught to lift them. The neighborhood was old Connecticut money box hedges trimmed square as court orders, dads in golf shirts, moms who never ran out of thank you notes. My mother fit the neighborhood like a diamond into a setting. She was a partner before the men thought she could be a donor, before the charities realized how much they needed her. In photographs, her hand rested on the shoulder of judges and hospital directors like a benediction. Inside our house, conversations moved like court transcripts, clean, precise, and subject to review. Sit up straight, Catherine. Don't mumble. Look people in the eye, then hold it. She admired results and work ethic the way other people admired newborns. Tenderness had its place on plaques and public stages, never across a kitchen sink. My father used to soften the edges. He would sit on the back steps with me at dusk, our porch light clicking on as if it loved us, pointing at the way the maple tree lifted its arms into the evening. He died when I was 12, the way summer ends too soon, leaving heat in the air and no sun to make sense of it. After the funeral, my mother folded her grief like a sweater and shelved it. Once in the pantry, I heard her cry without sound, her shoulders shaking like a held-back storm. Then the door opened. The storm was gone. She went back to work. I clung to the one thing that made sense. The camera my father left in his desk, scratched black metal, heavy as truth. Through the lens, even our house softened. Light found its way down the banister and rested there. The viewfinder taught me that the world could be framed with mercy. I learned to wait for a breath between expressions, to see people in that unguarded fraction of a second when their true face arrived. My mother called it a hobby. Capture sunsets on your own time, Catherine. Secure your future on mine. When my high school exhibition opened, she texted that the firm's merger had moved up. The chair with her name card sat empty, like a joke too flat to tell. Mrs. Sullivan. My art teacher said my portraits of strangers made them look known. I nodded and said thank you, but my eyes kept drifting toward the door. It went on like that. I was admitted to NYU for photography. My mother sent me a spreadsheet of alternative majors that wouldn't starve you. I took the train to see my grandmother 2 hours away and learned what home felt like in clutter and warm cookies. Grandma Julia kept my photos in frames that didn't match and said, "Make beauty anyway." She wrapped a used but perfect camera in brown paper for my 16th birthday and hugged me like a vow. I left for New York with alone a scholarship and a spine half built. I learned to make soup from whatever was cheapest, to share a bathroom with 2 roommates and an industrious colony of silverfish, to watch the city's lights from the roof and imagine they belonged to people I might someday know. I graduated. I found piecemeal work. Then I found Thompson Media's glass box office, and took the compromise creative director track because compromise pays rent. I told myself I'd build my portfolio on nights and weekends. I did. I shot portraits on stoops, hands at work in barbershops and corner florists, the quiet bravery of faces riding the last train home. Some of it landed in small galleries. A few editors learned my name. A friend named Tara, loud, funny, merciless, in her honesty stood over my shoulder and said, "Stop hiding." She's the kind of person who laughs with her whole chest. She's also the kind who shows up with moving boxes and a plan when your ceiling collapses. The ceiling did collapse well, the pipe above it, but water doesn't distinguish. It moved through drywall into sockets across floors, into files. My apartment filled with the sharp smell of damp plaster and ruined paper. The backup drive hummed once and died. I called my mother. She said insurance exists for a reason and hung up before advice could sound like comfort. Tara put a clean pillowcase on her couch, took me to the laundromat, and sat on a plastic chair while my grief tumbled warm and senseless behind glass. When we got back, she taped a note to my laptop. "You haven't even begun." That was the night James walked toward one of my prints at a group show, leaned in and said, "You don't steal moments. You wait for them to offer themselves." He said it without calculation. Later over coffee, he told me about chasing stories, rivers drying up in places that had never learned thirst, farmers who knew the exact color of sky that meant hail. He looked at people the way I did, as whole novels, not bullet points. When he introduced my work to his editors, he did it like passing a hand-me-down sweater that had kept him warm. Then came the email with the masthead I had dreamed about, an international assignment, 6 months across Europe and Asia, documenting traditional artisans before their crafts disappeared into assembly lines and scroll feeds. My boss approved a leave because it made good press. James mapped his travel to intersect mine. Tara bought me a luggage scale and said, 3 pairs of shoes. The world will still turn. I decided to tell my mother at her 60th, not because I believed it would please her, but because a clean public announcement would make it real. The invitation arrived on thick cream cardstock, Greenwich Country Club, black tie, a celebration of excellence. I remember staring at those words and feeling their weight, as if excellence were something you measured under a microscope and wrote in ink. The day of the party, the sky was a perfect early summer blue, the kind that makes even accountants forgive themselves. I arrived early, hoping to be useful. The staff didn't need me. My mother did an inspection, one gloved hand, gliding over linen as if she could feel wrinkles without seeing them. "Green," she said, taking me in with a single scan. "Bold for evening. We'll make do." She said it like a judge's ruling, final, polite, unarguable. Guests drifted in with cologne and careful laughter. Wealth sat comfortably in that room. Stories involved second homes, admissions, letters, a hedge fund that had learned to feel like a family. My mother floated from group to group, warmer than I'd ever known her. She asked about children by name. She made people feel chosen. It was a talent. I watched it like you watch a magician and learn where the sleeve ends. I found my seat at a table near the doors, close to the waiters and their whispered choreography. At the main table, my mother placed Thomas where everyone could see him and said junior partner with the pride of a grandmother unwrapping a birth announcement. He deserved it. He works hard. I lifted my glass to him across the room. He gave me a small, grateful nod. Music softened into the sound of forks on plates and silver against china. When the servers cleared dessert, I stood and tapped my glass. I kept the toast simple, graceful, grateful, harmless. I thanked her for teaching me discipline, for showing me what persistence does. I didn't mention what it costs. When the room relaxed back into its hum, I stepped to the main table to tell her privately. "I have some news," I said softly. "A magazine wants me on assignment." After cake, she murmured without looking up, gaze already sliding back to a partner across the table. "Timing matters. Just a minute. Thomas." She cut in smoothly, louder. "Did you tell them about Westbrook, the account?" He brightened, launched into it. Applause. Clapping on the back. I tried again. It's a prestigious Catherine has an art project, she said, plastering a smile to the words. The women nearest us tilted their heads, curious. I said the magazine's name. Their eyebrows rose. Even Thomas looked impressed. One of her friends leaned forward. Eleanor, that's a coup. My mother's smile cooled by a single degree. Well, it's a step above hobbies, she said, lifting her glass. But stability matters. Passion doesn't fund retirement. Then, like tossing off a joke that wasn't, she added. And as for retirement, Thomas handled the updates. Catherine, you needn't concern yourself. You're not getting a cent. You've always been... She let the sentence fade, the cruelty neat as a signature. The room didn't gasp. It did something quieter. Conversation thinned to threads. A waiter hesitated with a coffee pot, eyes down. Amanda looked at her napkin as if it were a map that could get her out. I felt my face stay still like a photograph in a loud room. Inside my chest, something tried to buck and run. I pressed my hand flat against the table until my palm hurt, and the world settled back into shape. I saw my mother, then not just the armor, but the woman beneath it. The widow who resented risk because it had taken everything once. The strategist who controlled the map so the terrain would stop surprising her. The person who could only love safety because it never left her crying in a pantry with the door closed. Understanding is not the same as excuse. It is simply light. I took a small sip of champagne and set the flute down carefully as if any sudden movement might shatter the last 10 years into glass. That's okay, I said, quiet enough that people had to lean in to hear, steady enough that my voice surprised even me. I didn't come for money. I came to tell you I'm leaving. For the first time that evening, her expression flickered shock like a draft through a tight house. Leaving. The assignment is 6 months. I may stay longer. James and I will be based overseas for a while. Around us, relief disguised itself as chatter. Someone at the far end of the table resumed a story about Provence. A violinist tuned, but the air close to us had changed weight. My mother's smile slipped. What remained was her bare face, beautiful and frightened and furious. She stood. Catherine, a word. She didn't ask. She led me down a quiet corridor paneled in dark wood, our footsteps tapping out a tidy argument on marble. The study smelled like leather and old paper. She closed the door with the care of a surgeon setting down a scalpel. What do you think you're doing? She asked, voice low, every syllable ironed. Answering a question you didn't ask, I said. My hands were steady now, like they are when I shoot in low light and trust my breath more than the camera. Announcing that in front of people, humiliating. You announced my worth in front of people, I said. I answered. Between us, the years gathered chairs pulled up to a table only we could see. Somewhere down the hall, the quartet began the first notes of Happy Birthday. The sound was muffled, patient, like rain on glass. I looked at the door, then back at her. In the reflection of the framed diplomas, I saw a woman in emerald standing straight for the first time in a house built for bending. I hadn't yet felt the loneliness that would follow the quiet of rooms without familiar pictures, the ache of leaving even a hard place. That would come next. For now, with the cake waiting and 100 careful guests rehearsing a song, I met my mother's eyes and understood the shape of what I had to carry. I put my hand on the brass handle and felt its cool certainty. I'll stay for the candles, I said, voice even. After that, we'll talk. I opened the door to a hallway that felt longer than it had when we came in, the music growing clearer. With every step, the air cooler, the lights a touch too bright. By the time I re-entered the ballroom, I knew exactly where I stood in the space between the life I had kept trying to earn and the one I was finally ready to claim. The room sang. My mother followed perfect smile restored, and the cake rolled in like a small edible monument. I sang too steady as a metronome, while a thin seam of sorrow opened quietly inside my chest, leading me toward a solitude I had never chosen before and would choose now. The candles burned low, and the last of the champagne had gone flat. I stayed until the applause faded, and the cake was nothing but crumbs on porcelain plates. My mother kept her composure, smiling for photographs, as if nothing had happened. When the band struck up its final song, I quietly slipped away through the corridor that led toward the parking lot. The air outside was heavy with the scent of lilacs and rain-soaked grass. I stood for a long moment beneath the portico lights, watching guests laugh as their drivers pulled around their lives untouched by the small earthquake that had happened inside. In the dark, I could still hear her voice, calm, precise, and cruel. "You're not getting a cent." The words should have shattered something in me, but what I felt instead was an eerie stillness. It was as if, after years of bracing for a storm, the wind had finally stopped, and I was left standing in the quiet aftermath. I drove back to the city with the window cracked open, the night air cold against my skin, headlights sweeping across the wet road like brief memories. Somewhere past the bridge, the tension broke. I started to cry, not the sharp kind that leaves you empty, but the slow, silent kind that feels like years finally spilling out. The next morning, sunlight cut through the blinds of Tara's apartment where I'd been staying since the flood. She was already up drinking coffee in one of her oversized sweatshirts. When she saw me step out of the spare room, she didn't ask anything right away. She just handed me a mug and waited. I told her what had happened, the laughter, the toast, the final insult. She listened quietly, only shaking her head once. When I finished, she exhaled through her nose, slow and deliberate. "I'm sorry," she said, "but I'm also proud. You finally saw her for who she is." "I thought I already had." "Not really," she said gently. "You kept hoping she'd turn into someone else." Her words landed somewhere deep. I stared down into my coffee, the surface trembling slightly in my hands. That morning, we packed the last of my belongings into Box's camera equipment, a few closed notebooks swollen with water damage. The apartment I'd signed for was still being repaired, so Tara insisted I stay longer. In her living room with its half-finished paintings and mismatched furniture, I felt the first hint of safety I'd known in years. Later that week, I walked through the park near the river, trying to untangle the conversation that kept replaying in my head. For most of my life, I had mistaken silence for strength, believing that endurance was a form of love. My mother had taught me how to stand tall, how to speak clearly, how to never show need. What she hadn't taught me was how to be kind to myself when the voice of judgment wasn't hers anymore. It was mine. By evening, the sky turned the color of pewter. I stopped at a bench, took out my old camera, and began to photograph the passing light. Faces blurred into streaks of motion. A woman carried lilies against her chest. A child held a paper boat chasing the last puddle of rainwater down the path. It struck me then that maybe I wasn't alone. There were others who had been measured and found wanting by people they loved. Maybe art was simply the proof that we kept trying to be seen, even when no one was looking. 2 days later, Thomas called. I almost didn't answer. We hadn't spoken much outside of family gatherings, and our relationship had always been formal. But something in his voice surprised me. It was careful, almost uncertain. "Kathy," he said, using the nickname no one in the family ever used. I wanted to say, "I'm sorry for what happened at the party." I didn't respond right away. The apology hung there fragile and real. "I should have said something sooner," he added. Mother was out of line. She was being herself, I said. "You don't have to take sides." "I'm not taking sides," he replied. "I just think you deserve better." That moment, simple as it was, cracked something open. I thanked him, and before we hung up, he said, "If you ever need help with anything, contacts overseas introductions, just ask." When I ended the call, I realized my hands were shaking. Maybe the bridge between us had always been there, waiting for one of us to cross. Over the next week, I threw myself into preparing for the assignment. The travel magazine's editor, a woman named Diane Keller, called to finalize details. Her voice had a calm authority, the kind that made everything sound achievable. "We'll start you in Barcelona," she said. "Then Florence, Prague, Kyoto. The focus is human craftsmanship, hands, tools, tradition. We want your perspective, not just documentation." I wrote down every word, my pulse quickening with each destination. At night, James came by after his own assignments. We'd eat takeout by the window, city lights flickering like reflections in water. He talked about the people he'd met on the road, fishermen in Iceland, a teacher in rural Kenya who built her own school. I listened, picturing the stories, the faces, the quiet bravery. When I told him about my mother, he didn't offer advice or pity. He simply took my hand and said, "You've been standing in her shadow for too long. It's time to step into your own light." On the morning I signed my travel contract, a message came from my mother. It was brief. "We need to talk." I ignored it. Another came the next day, and then the next. Her tone shifted from cold to pleading. I let them sit unread, knowing that answering too soon would drag me back into the same orbit. Tara, ever pragmatic, warned me not to meet her alone. "She'll twist it," she said. "Make it sound like you're ungrateful. Wait until you're steady." But when the third message arrived, something in the wording caught me. "Please, Catherine." Not over the phone. There was a trace of vulnerability that I hadn't heard since childhood, maybe not even then. Against better judgment, I agreed to meet her. We chose a small cafe halfway between the city and Connecticut. It was quiet, the kind of place where the walls absorbed voices. She arrived exactly on time, wearing a gray suit and pearls, her hair perfectly pinned. When she saw me, she hesitated, as though the person sitting across from her wasn't the same daughter she had once commanded like an assistant. "You look thin," she said, adjusting her napkin. "Are you eating properly?" "I'm fine." The conversation faltered, filled with the small talk of people who didn't know where to begin. Finally, she looked up from her coffee. "I've been thinking about the other night. Perhaps I was harsh." Harsh? The word felt small beside what she had said. She shifted in her seat. I was embarrassed. The evening got away from me. "But you caught me off guard, Catherine." "That announcement, I wasn't trying to embarrass you," I said quietly. "I just wanted you to know I was finally doing something that mattered to me." Her eyes flicked to the window. "I understand that now." The silence stretched, filled with the hum of other conversations. For a moment, I saw something unfamiliar on her face, regret maybe, or exhaustion. She stirred her coffee perfectly, even circles, then said, "Perhaps we could see each other in Europe. Paris, maybe. We could reconnect." It was such an unexpected offer that I didn't know what to say. "Maybe," I managed, "if the schedule allows." She nodded, satisfied by the neutrality of my response. Then she spoke about people asking questions, her friends from the firm, the neighbors who'd heard I was leaving. I realized then that this meeting wasn't just about me. It was about controlling the narrative. Still, when she reached across the table and touched my arm. The gesture startled me. It wasn't tenderness exactly, but it wasn't performance either. "I don't want us to end badly," she said. "You're my daughter. Whatever differences we have, that doesn't change." For years, I had longed to hear those words. Yet now that they'd come, they felt oddly weightless, like air escaping a balloon. I paid for my coffee and stood. "I'll send you my itinerary," I said. "You can decide if Paris fits." As I walked to my car, the wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of spring rain. I didn't cry. I just breathed deep, deliberate breaths that filled my lungs with something close to freedom. Back at Tara's that evening, I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, then said, "She's testing your boundary. You held it. That's progress." We toasted with cheap wine, laughing softly at how adulthood can feel like learning to speak again after years of silence. Days passed in a blur of errands and lists. I sold what I didn't need, boxed up what I couldn't part with, and visited my grandmother's grave before leaving. The cemetery was quiet, except for the wind moving through the trees. I placed a bouquet of daisies at the base of the stone. "I'm finally going," I whispered. "The way you always told me to." The words felt both heavy and light, as if they carried her approval into the air. 2 nights before my flight, my mother called again. This time, I answered. Her voice was softer, almost hesitant. "Catherine, be careful abroad. Send me your schedule." "I will." There was a pause. "Your father would be proud of your courage." It was the first time she'd said his name in years. My throat tightened, but I only said, "Thank you," and ended the call before the silence grew too long. At the airport, Tara helped me with my luggage, her energy filling every quiet space. "Show them what you can do," she said. "And if you meet any handsome Europeans, take pictures for research." I laughed, grateful for her steadiness. James texted from Barcelona, a photo of the sea, a caption that read, "Waiting for you." As I walked through security, the sound of rolling suitcases echoed like waves on a shore I hadn't reached yet. For the first time, I wasn't running from something. I was walking toward it, toward a life that might finally belong to me. Outside the gate windows, the dawn spread pale and wide across the sky. I watched it quietly, feeling the world tilt forward slow and certain into the next chapter. The flight lifted through low clouds, the city shrinking beneath a sheet of early morning haze. I watched the coastline disappear, the sunlight turning the water into a field of glass. For the first time in years, there was nothing pulling me back. No unfinished apology, no expectation to meet. Just a quiet hum inside me, steady and strange, like a door had finally closed. Barcelona greeted me with the warmth of late spring. The air smelled faintly of salt and oranges, and the city moved at a rhythm that felt both slow and alive. My small apartment overlooked a narrow street lined with balconies and rust-red shutters. Below, an old man sold paper cones of roasted almonds from a cart. The scent drifted upward as I unpacked my cameras and tried to imagine this place as home. The first week passed in a blur of work. I visited artisans in small workshops, hands smoothing clay carving wood, weaving threads the color of sunset. I photographed everything, the quiet repetition of skill, the patience that lived in each motion. These people didn't chase approval. They created because they must. In their rhythm, I recognized something I had almost lost in myself. Every night, I sent the day's photographs to the magazine. Diane's replies came quickly, always brief, but encouraging. "Excellent framing," she wrote. "You're catching the soul of the craft." Those words meant more than she probably intended. For years, I'd been told to measure worth in profit and prestige. Here I was measuring it in light. 3 weeks later, James arrived. He looked tired, but content, the kind of weariness that comes from doing what you love. We met at a seaside cafe where the air tasted of coffee and ocean spray. He slid into the seat across from me, grinning as if we'd never been apart. "You look different," he said. "Happier." "I feel it," I admitted, maybe for the first time. We spent that evening walking along the harbor, the lamps casting silver paths across the water. When he reached for my hand, it felt natural, as though we'd been walking toward that moment for years. Work took us in different directions over the next month. He went north to document a reforestation project while I traveled through small Spanish villages where the roads wound like ribbons through the hills. I stayed with an elderly potter named Elena, who spoke little English but seemed to understand everything that mattered. Her house smelled of clay and lavender. She worked with a steadiness that fascinated me, spinning her wheel as sunlight moved across the room. One afternoon, as I photographed her shaping a bowl, she paused and gestured for me to take her place. I hesitated, then sat at the wheel. My hands trembled as I tried to mimic her motion. The clay wobbled and collapsed. She laughed softly, shaking her head. Too careful, she said, her accent thick, but her meaning clear. "You must trust the form before it exists." That night, I wrote those words in my notebook. Maybe that was the lesson I had been missing all along. Not everything needed to be controlled. Some things required faith before evidence. A month later, my first photo essay went live on the magazine's site. They titled it Hands of Time. It was a quiet collection, not dramatic or sensational, but honest. To my surprise, readers responded with warmth and curiosity. Messages came from teachers, students, even a retired carpenter who wrote, "Thank you for reminding us that work can still have grace." I read that line over and over, feeling something uncoil inside me. The days fell into rhythm work, travel, editing, writing. I slept deeply for the first time in years. The gnawing voice that had lived in the back of my mind, the one that always asked if I was enough, grew quieter. When my mother's emails arrived polite and perfunctory, I answered briefly without the usual anxiety. She asked how the project was going, if I was staying safe. I told her the truth, that I was well. She replied, "Good to hear," and that was enough. In late summer, the magazine sent me to Florence. The city was everything people promised: stone streets echoing with music, sunlight sliding across domes and bridges. I met an art conservator named Sophia who restored Renaissance frescoes in a small studio that smelled of dust and linseed oil. She showed me how the faintest colors, ochre, ultramarine, vermilion, came alive when touched with patience. Watching her work felt like witnessing time itself being mended. We became friends easily. Some evenings we'd sit on her rooftop sipping wine and watching the city fade into gold. She asked once about my family, and I told her the truth in the simplest way I could. "My mother sees life like a contract," I said. "Everything must yield profit or proof. Love doesn't fit into her terms." Sophia nodded quiet for a while. "Then perhaps your art is the proof she never asked for," she said. Proof that beauty can exist without approval. It stayed with me long after I left Florence. By autumn, the project had expanded. The editors wanted me to include a personal essay alongside the photographs. I hesitated. Writing about myself felt too close, too exposed. But James encouraged me. "You've already told the story," he said. "You just need to put the camera down long enough to see it." So I wrote about what it meant to chase recognition and what it cost to stop. The words came easily, like a tide that had waited years to rise. When the essay was published, my mother was the first person to call. Her voice was unreadable. "Your article is circulating," she said. "People at the firm have mentioned it. Good or bad?" She hesitated. "They said it was moving." For a heartbeat, I didn't know how to answer. "Thank you for letting me know," I said at last. "I didn't realize," she added quietly, "that you felt unseen. I thought I was pushing you toward security." "I know." There was a long pause. "Perhaps I pushed too hard." Her words hung there small, hesitant, but real. It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was the first honest thing she'd said in years. We spoke for a few more minutes, mostly about work and travel. When we ended the call, I sat by the window for a long time, watching the street lamps glow against the darkening sky. The conversation hadn't healed everything, but it had cracked the distance between us just enough for light to get in. By winter, I was in Prague, photographing glassblowers in a dim workshop, where the air shimmered with heat. Outside, snow fell in slow spirals, muting the world to a hush. I found a kind of peace in that silence, a steadiness that felt earned. Each place I visited left something behind, a lesson, a phrase, a gesture that belonged to no one but me. James and I met again in Paris. It was raining the night we arrived, the streets shining like mirrors. We found a small restaurant near the Seine, its windows fogged from warmth. Over dinner, he reached across the table and took my hand. "You've changed," he said softly. "Not in a way that takes you away, but in a way that brings you back to yourself." I smiled, not sure how to answer. Maybe I finally stopped waiting for permission. He nodded his thumb, tracing slow circles over my fingers. "That's what freedom looks like." The next evening, we walked to the river as the city lights flickered against the water. He stopped at a quiet spot near the bridge where a street musician was playing a gentle tune on the violin. The music seemed to float between us, tender and uncertain. When he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small ring, a simple band of hammered silver, I understood before he spoke. "I don't want to change your path," he said. "I want to walk it with you." For a moment, the world narrowed to the sound of rain and the faint hum of the violin. I said yes, not out of surprise or impulse, but because everything in me already knew the answer. We celebrated with friends from the magazine the next day, laughing over wine and stories from the road. I sent a message to Tara, who replied instantly. "About time, I expect an invitation and good wine." Even Thomas wrote, offering his congratulations. I hadn't realized how far my circle of kindness had grown until that moment. A week later, my mother called again. Her voice carried a gentleness I hadn't heard before. "James seems to understand you," she said. "That's important." I smiled. "He does." "I'm glad," she said simply. That night, as I sat on the balcony overlooking the city, I thought about how far I'd come from that glittering ballroom where the humiliation began. My life had stretched beyond those walls, beyond her control, into something wide and real. And somewhere in the quiet between the bells and the rain, I felt it, the shift from needing to be seen to finally seeing myself. The horizon had changed color, soft and endless, like the start of something I had only begun to understand. Spring in Barcelona feels like a slow exhale. The air turns soft again, the light stretching longer each evening, until the city seems to glow from within. After months of travel, James and I decided to make this place our home base. Our apartment was small, just 2 rooms and a narrow balcony overlooking a courtyard, but it felt alive with possibility. Every wall carried the scent of the sea. Every morning began with the sound of church bells echoing from somewhere unseen. My work with the magazine continued to grow. They commissioned more stories, sometimes sending me across Europe on short assignments. But now, for the first time, I wasn't chasing approval or recognition. I was chasing truth, those quiet human moments that existed beneath achievement. I had started a new series on generational craft, capturing apprentices learning from elders. The theme felt personal, as though I were somehow repairing my own family's broken line through the lens of others who passed wisdom with open hands. James worked alongside me often, his camera focused on the broader stories of place and environment. We moved in sync, like two people speaking the same unspoken language. Even in the silence of long train rides, or the exhaustion after long days of shooting, there was peace. It wasn't a love built on rescue or need, but on recognition. He saw me clearly, and that changed how I saw myself. When the first collection of my photographs was accepted by a respected Barcelona gallery, I sent an invitation to my mother without much expectation. I wanted her to know, not to prove. Weeks passed without reply. Then on the morning of the opening, a message arrived. It was brief, only 3 words, "I'll be there." I told no one. I wasn't sure if it was hope or dread that quickened my pulse. That evening, the gallery lights were soft and golden, washing the walls in warmth. People moved quietly between frames, murmuring their impressions. My photographs lined the space, hands weaving carving shaping. People whose craft held stories older than memory. At the center hung a self-portrait I hadn't planned to include, but couldn't leave out a reflection caught in a glass workshop window. My face faint behind the flame of a torch. When I turned, she was there. Eleanor stood just inside the doorway. Silver hair swept neatly back, dressed simply for once. Her eyes traveled along the walls, pausing on each image. She looked smaller than I remembered, not weaker, just less certain. I approached her slowly, unsure what to say. She was the one who spoke first. "These are remarkable," she said. Her voice carried none of its usual sharpness. "There's something in them. Stillness." "Thank you," I said quietly. The words felt heavier than they should have. She studied the self-portrait for a long moment. "You look peaceful." "I am," I answered. She nodded almost to herself. "I can see that." We stood there together, the silence between us no longer barbed, just fragile. After a while, she asked if I could introduce her to some of the artisans. I promised I would, and we spent the next hour walking slowly through the exhibition. She listened as I explained each story, each craft, as though hearing a new language. When it was over, she turned to me and said, "You've built something lasting, Catherine. I was wrong to think only stability could protect you." It wasn't an apology, not in so many words, but I felt the intent beneath it. For a woman like my mother, those few words cost more than most people would ever know. Before she left, she asked me to sign a copy of the exhibit catalog. When she took it in her hands, she said softly, "I'd like to display this at my office." That sentence, simple, sincere, felt like years of silence finally breaking open. The following weeks passed in a quiet blur. My mother sent messages more often, small updates, questions about travel, or brief comments about articles she'd read. I responded lightly, careful not to expect too much. I knew she would never become someone new, but she was trying, and for now, that was enough. James and I spent that summer traveling between projects Florence, Prague, Kyoto. Each city left its own rhythm in me. In Florence, I photographed a young apprentice learning to restore marble. In Prague, a family of glassmakers who had survived wars and regimes. In Kyoto, an elderly couple taught me how patience could be its own form of devotion. Their house was small with tatami floors and a garden where the wind carried the scent of pine. They fed me simple meals and treated me as if I had always belonged there. One afternoon, as I was packing my camera, the woman pressed my hands between hers and said in halting English, "You see people. That is rare." I didn't know how to answer, so I just bowed, holding her gaze until words were unnecessary. Those encounters stayed with me. They were lessons in humility, in the quiet beauty of being seen without expectation. By the time we returned to Barcelona, I no longer felt the constant ache to prove myself. My career was growing, yes, but what mattered more was that it had grown on my own terms. One afternoon in late autumn, as sunlight spilled through the window of our apartment, James set down his coffee and looked at me across the table. "Your mother called me," he said gently. My heart paused. "She wanted to coordinate something with you, New York. There's a gallery interested in showing your work." I stared at him surprised. "She called you directly?" He nodded. "Said she thought you might ignore her." The gallery's offer turned out to be a joint exhibition of international photographers whose work centered on heritage and craft. My collection fit perfectly. I hesitated, unsure if returning to New York was wise, but James convinced me it was time. "You've built your story," he said. "Let her see the full picture." The opening night was held in early winter snow, dusting the streets outside. The gallery's tall windows glowed against the cold, and I could see people moving inside as I approached. My mother arrived just before the event began, flanked by 2 colleagues from her firm, but she wasn't performing this time. She moved quietly, greeting people without pretense, genuinely curious about the art. When she reached me, she took my hands, her touch warm, steady. "Thank you for inviting me," she said. "I wasn't sure you'd come." She smiled faintly. "Neither was I." The night unfolded gently. People lingered near my photographs, discussing composition and light. At one point, I caught sight of my mother standing before a portrait of an elderly potter from Spain, her expression unreadable. When she finally turned to me, her eyes were bright. "I think I understand now," she said. "This isn't about success, is it? It's about witness." I nodded. "Yes, about paying attention to what endures." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a letter written in her careful, deliberate handwriting. "I've been thinking a lot about legacy," she said, "and about the people we leave it to." Her voice trembled slightly, but she didn't look away. "I want you to have the house, the one in Connecticut. It was always meant to hold family, and I see now that you're the one carrying that forward." The words landed softly, almost unbelievable in their simplicity. I didn't speak right away. I just looked at her, seeing a woman who had finally allowed herself to bend. For the first time, her gesture wasn't control disguised as generosity. It was acknowledgement. Later, as the evening wound down, she stood beside me while the gallery owner announced my upcoming European series. The applause was warm, but not overwhelming, and when I glanced at her, she was clapping too. There was pride in her eyes, muted but unmistakable. After everyone had left, we walked together to the curb. Snowflakes drifted through the air, melting as they touched her coat. She looked up at the sky and said almost to herself, "Your father would have loved this." I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat sudden and sharp. "I think so too." She smiled then, an unguarded human smile that made her seem younger. "I'll see you soon," she said. I watched her car pull away, the taillights glowing red against the snow, and felt something inside me settle. The distance between us would never vanish entirely, but it had finally stopped growing. Back in Barcelona, our life unfolded in quiet, steady ways. My next projects took me further. Morocco, Greece, Iceland, each place adding its own color to the tapestry of work that had begun in its own way with a moment of humiliation years before. Every photograph I took felt like proof that grace can follow pain, that truth can grow where pride once lived. Sometimes, late at night, I would sit on the balcony, the air cool against my skin, and reread the letter my mother had given me. The last line always struck the same chord. "You saw beauty where I saw risk." Thank you for teaching me to look again. It wasn't forgiveness or absolution, it was understanding. And for me, that was enough. The girl who once waited for permission was gone. In her place stood a woman who had learned that peace is not the absence of pain, but the choice to no longer let it define you. The winter wind moved softly through the courtyard, carrying the faint scent of salt from the sea. Somewhere below, a church bell chimed. I closed my eyes and listened, knowing that the story wasn't over yet, but that it was at last my own to tell. The first light of dawn reached across the balcony, turning the city pale gold. Below the courtyard fountain trickled softly, the sound mixing with the flutter of doves waking on the rooftops. The air smelled faintly of jasmine from the neighbor's garden, and for a moment I simply stood there, wrapped in a blanket, watching the world exhale. Peace didn't arrive as a sudden revelation. It crept in quietly, like light filling a darkened room, one window at a time. James was still asleep inside the morning breeze, lifting the curtain beside the bed. His camera bag rested near the door, already packed for the next trip Morocco this time. I had turned down that assignment, choosing instead to stay behind and prepare my next exhibition. For the first time in my life, saying no didn't feel like fear or guilt. It felt like choice. I made coffee and sat at the small kitchen table, my hands curved around the warm mug. On the wall across from me hung a photograph I had taken years ago in Prague, a craftsman holding glass so thin it caught the light like water. It had become my quiet reminder of balance. Fragile things can still endure when handled with care. A week after returning from New York, my mother called. The conversation was brief but calm. She had finalized the papers transferring the house in Connecticut to me and wanted me to know that she wasn't doing it as restitution, but as acknowledgement. It's time it belonged to someone who sees it as more than an address, she said. Her tone was measured, but beneath it, I heard something new: relief, maybe even release. I didn't promise to move back. I thanked her instead. After we hung up, I realized I no longer needed to prove I deserved the gesture. Acceptance, it turned out, could exist without surrender. Later that month, I flew back briefly to visit the property. The house stood, as I remembered it, white shutters, ivy crawling up one side, and the same oak tree that had shaded the porch since I was a child. Dust covered the piano in the living room, the same one my father used to play late at night when work was done. I opened the lid and touched the keys. They were out of tune, but the melody that came was enough to fill the silence. Standing there, I realized how long I had carried ghosts of expectation through every decision I'd made. I had believed leaving meant abandoning, when in truth, it had allowed something new to grow. The rooms no longer felt like evidence of what I'd lost. They were simply spaces waiting to hold whatever came next. Before I left, I placed one framed photograph on the mantel, a picture of my grandmother Julia, taken the summer before she passed. In it, she's smiling, a camera in her lap. I whispered a quiet thank you to the woman who had believed in beauty long before anyone else did. Then I locked the door behind me, not out of finality, but gratitude. Back in Barcelona, life unfolded gently. The gallery confirmed my next show for spring, an intimate collection titled Inheritance of Light. The photographs focused on hands, again this time, capturing both youth and age in the same framecraft being passed forward. My editor said it felt like coming full circle, though I knew it was more like finding center. In February, James and I were married on a small stretch of beach just outside the city. We kept it simple, no grand gestures, no staged perfection. Tara stood beside me as my witness, her eyes glistening when she adjusted the veil that kept slipping in the sea breeze. My mother flew in quietly the night before. She didn't offer speeches or opinions. She simply arrived, took my hands before the ceremony, and said, "You've built a good life, Catherine. I hope you know I'm proud." It wasn't dramatic, but it was honest. That was all I'd ever wanted. During the reception, she spoke softly with James, smiling in a way that surprised me. Later, as the sun began to set, she approached me and placed a small velvet box in my palm. Inside was my grandmother's locket, polished, restored, shining, like it had been waiting for this moment. "It's yours," she said. It always should have been. When she left the next morning, we didn't promise constant contact or weekly calls. We understood our rhythm now, measured, respectful enough. Some love grows not through closeness, but through space where people can finally breathe. As the months passed, our life settled into a rhythm both ordinary and full. Mornings spent editing photographs, afternoons exploring hidden corners of the city, evenings cooking simple meals while the radio hummed quietly in the background. I began teaching weekend workshops for young photographers, children, and retirees. Anyone curious about storytelling through images. Watching them discover the world through a lens reminded me of who I was at 16, that girl with a borrowed camera and a stubborn dream. Sometimes during those classes, I caught myself using my mother's phrases: stand straighter, focus, don't rush. Only now they came from a gentler place. It struck me that even the hardest lessons can soften when carried differently. One morning in late spring, I received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph of my mother standing in front of one of my prints at her office, the same self-portrait from my first exhibition. On the back, she had written in her familiar, precise handwriting, "I finally see it now." It was never rebellion. It was courage. I pinned the photo above my desk next to a postcard of the Barcelona skyline at dusk. That evening when James came home, I showed it to him. He smiled and said, "That's her way of saying she loves you." "I know," I replied, "and that's enough." The following year moved quietly but fully. My work reached places I'd once only imagined. I was invited to speak at a photography symposium in Florence to discuss art as legacy. I began by telling the audience that art, like forgiveness, doesn't erase what came before. It simply makes room for what comes next. Afterward, as people filtered out of the hall, a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She said she had grown up with a mother who never approved of her choices either, but hearing my story made her believe she could keep trying. I didn't know what to say, so I hugged her. Sometimes peace spreads like that, quietly, from one steady heart to another. When we returned home that summer, our balcony garden was blooming. The air smelled of rosemary and sea salt. I sat outside with a glass of wine while James edited his latest photographs on the couch inside. The evening light reached across the tiles, painting everything in gold. From somewhere below, a child laughed. The sound rose upward, bright and untamed, filling the courtyard like a song. I realized, listening to it, that peace isn't the absence of history, it's the presence of understanding. It's knowing what to keep and what to finally let go. As the last of the sun dipped below the rooftops, I lifted my camera and took one more photograph, not for a gallery, not for anyone else, just for me. The image caught the reflection of the fading light against our window. The sky washed in soft amber. It felt like closure without ending, like life continuing in a language I finally understood. Some wounds don't fade because we forgive. They fade because we stop reopening them. And some legacies aren't inherited, they're rebuilt, one quiet decision at a time. If this story spoke to you, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever had to build peace from the pieces of old pain, share this with someone who might need to hear it. Thank you for staying with me until the end, and remember, sometimes the gentlest victories last the longest.